just giving it a couple extra minutes because I know people are having a difficult time getting into rooms. So welcome everyone to the Hebrew Bible, an introduction to the canon. And we're going to start off by just watching a video that's going to really shape our conversation for the next 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to start the video.
Judaism's pretty focused on what you do from day to day. Not just when and how to pray, but how to eat, raise kids, farm, cut your fingernails. If you want to learn how to live in a Jewish way, you can watch all our videos, but eventually you're going to want to dive into Jewish law, or halakha. Some people say halacha, some people say halakha, which means the path or the way. Here's an overview. It starts with the Torah. The Torah is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible includes the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. For short, you can call the Hebrew Bible Tanakh, which stands for Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. If you're Jewish, saying Tanakh beats the pants off saying Old Testament, which is a Christian term used in contrast to the New Testament. When the Hebrew Bible was being codified, there was debate over which books to include in the canon. And there's a whole list of books called the Apocrypha that didn't quite make the cut. Some of these books are actually in the Christian Bible, the Book of Maccabees, for instance. And there's other books called the Pseudepigrapha that didn't make it into anyone's Bible. Inside the Hebrew Bible, there are lots of laws and stories that later generations weren't sure how to interpret. For example, the Torah says not to work on the Sabbath, but what does that mean? What's work? Does it apply to office jobs or just manual labor? Does it include working out? So along come 6 relatively short books called the Mishnah, which try to explain it in a style that's pretty straightforward and sparse. The Mishnah gives a list of 39 things not to do on Shabbat, like baking, sewing, building, etc. It doesn't really explain why those 39 activities are forbidden, it just gives the list. And then, just as the Mishnah tries to explain the Torah, there's another set of books that attempt to explain the Mishnah. This is called the Gemara, and it's massive. 63 tractates, or sections. The Gemara elaborates on the Mishnah by going into a long conversation. So the Mishnah says simply, you can't thresh on Shabbat. Great, no problem, you say. But the rabbis in the Gemara took on, what does that mean for us today? And they extrapolated, well, you can't just avoid threshing grain. The act of removing a seed kernel from its tough outer layer is a lot like shucking corn, so let's not do that either. You also can't wring out a washcloth or squeeze lemon into your tea. Extrapolation. Together, the Mishnah and Gemara are called the Talmud. There are 2 Talmuds, the Babylonian, or the Bavli, and the Jerusalem edition, or the Yerushalmi. Same basic idea, but they were put together in 2 different locations, so they have some really interesting variations. The Talmud is so large that yet another set of texts came along to simplify and codify it, the Mishnah Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. And yet, if you spent years making your way through all those texts, you still wouldn't know everything Jewish, like, say, whether escalators are allowed on Shabbat. So along comes modern Jewish case law. People send questions about specific situations to an expert and receive written answers called responsa. You can look up responsa online, and they cover everything from immunization to gambling to escalators. The written Torah is considered sacred, obviously, and Jews view all the texts that came after as sacred also. They are known as oral Torah. Jewish law is not frozen in time, it's continuing to unfold today. Local communities are empowered to study and interpret halakha. This varies a lot in different branches of Judaism today. In some communities, all the texts that we've discussed are considered binding. And if there's a question about them, you go to your local rabbi, whose decisions are binding. In other communities, people are individually free to study and make their own decisions about halakha. These really different approaches to understanding and observing Jewish law are one of the main differences behind different Jewish movements. For more about the various Jewish movements, watch the next video in the Judaism 101.
So that's just a overview of the different parts of both the Bible, which we're going to focus on today, and further Jewish writings and Jewish law. So where to begin? Some basic terminology to make sure that we're all on the same page with this. So Jews refer to this time, the Common Era, as CE. We use this in place of AD because AD means in the year of our Lord. And since we, as Jews, do not focus on Jesus being our Lord, we use the abbreviation CE when talking about this era. And we use BCE when talking about before the Common Era, or in other words, before the year 0. And we use that BCE, before the Common Era, in place of BC, which means before Christ. So just so that we're clear on how we refer to different periods of history as we look at the different biblical pieces. So the Bible is canonized, which means it's fixed. The word canon comes from the Greek word canon, and it means any straight rod or bar, a rule, a standard of excellence, and perhaps it comes from the word kanan, which means reed. In Hebrew, we also have the word kaneh, which means stalk or reed or measuring stick or line. So the canon is basically the end of any adding of additional material to the Bible. That's what it means when we say that the Bible is canonized. We cannot add any more books to it or writings to it. It's fixed in time. So Jews refer to the Bible as Tanakh. And we'll talk about the 3 parts of Tanakh, but we don't use the word, as Jews, we tend not to use the word Bible, because then that might include the Christian scriptures, which some refer to as the New Testament, and the Jewish scriptures, which some refer to as the Old Testament. So Tanakh is an acronym of the 3 parts of the text, and in the Tanakh, its entirety, we find 24 books. So the first 5 books are known as the Pentateuch. It is also known to us as Torah, and you can see I put a picture there of what actually, we have 2 Torahs, 2 Sifrei Torah in the Ark, and what those Torahs contain are the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures. So let's learn a little bit about those as well. Actually, this is the Parsha of this week, so it's a bit of an introduction to this week's Torah portion, which is Chaye Sarah.
Hi everyone, I'm David Block.
And I'm Emu Shalev.
Welcome to the Parsha Experiment. Parshat Chaye Sarah. Let's be honest, compared to some of the exciting stories in these last few weeks, the stories in this week's Parsha seem much less exciting. We don't have anything grand like creation or the flood or the binding of Isaac.
Let's take a look at what actually happens in this week's Parsha. Bring up the clock, 20 seconds, let's go. Sarah dies and Abraham buys a burial plot. There's a long and detailed story about the journey of Abraham's servant to find a wife for Abraham's son Isaac. He finds Rebekah, who returns with him to Abraham and joins the family. Abraham marries Keturah and has a few more kids, and then Abraham dies.
So this is just to show you this week's Torah portion. And we read from the Torah 1 section each week throughout the year. So it takes us an entire year to read through the Torah. So each week we read a different section. And the section assigned this week that was read this morning is the life of Sarah, which is an interesting name for it because actually it begins with Sarah dying.
Now, the bulk of the Parsha...
So, we look at Chaye Sarah, the story of Sarah, and we find it in the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus about the Exodus from Egypt, Leviticus and Numbers, wandering in the desert, and Deuteronomy getting ready to, well, Deuteronomy is really a review of the first 4 books, but also getting the people ready to go into the promised land. The Torah as a collection this is the first part that was established as a canon. It was pulled together after the fall of Jerusalem in around the year 586 BCE. That's when it was put together and known for the first 5 books. It's regarded as fixed by the 4th century BCE, so that's before the Common Era. And the Torah is seen as the most authoritative of all of Jewish literature. This is where it starts. And the stories that we read and the ways that we are told to behave or not behave, that forms the basis for Jewish tradition. The second section of the Tanakh, the T standing for Torah, the N in Tanakh, or the Nun standing for Nevi'im. We see that there are 4 sections of former prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, and the later prophets, those that came after. And some of these are considered to be major prophets and minor prophets. The minor prophets in the Jewish scriptures, in the Tanakh, are all put together as one group of 12 books. But if you open a Christian Bible, you'll see that they're separated out, and each one of its own in its own book. So let's hear a little bit about the prophets.
Ezekiel, Obadiah, Habakkuk. What do these names have in common? Well, they're 3 of the 15 prophets that have their own books in the Bible.
And if you've tried to read these books, odds are you got lost in their dense poetry and strange imagery. But these books are super important for understanding the overall biblical story.
So let's talk about how to read the prophets. When I hear the word prophet, I think of a fortune teller, someone who predicts the future.
That's what being a prophet means in many cultures, but not in the Bible. While the biblical prophets sometimes speak about the future, they're way more than fortune tellers.
How should I think about them?
Well, they were Israelites who had a radical encounter with God's presence, and then were commissioned to go and speak on God's behalf.
Like a representative.
Right. And the thing that they cared about the most is the mutual partnership that existed between God and the Israelites.
Right, the partnership. God rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt and invited them to become a nation of justice and generosity that would represent his character to the nations.
And so this partnership required all Israelites to give their trust and allegiance to their God alone. In the Bible, this partnership's called the covenant.
But the leaders, the priests, the kings, led Israel astray, and they broke the covenant.
And so this is where the prophets came in, to remind Israel of their role in the partnership. And they did this in 3 ways. First, they were constantly accusing Israel for violating the terms of the covenant. The charges usually include idolatry, alliances with other nations and their gods, and allowing injustice towards the poor.
So like covenant lawyers.
Right. And so second, the prophets called the Israelites to repent, which means simply to turn around. They spoke of God's mercy to forgive them if they would just confess and change their ways.
But Israel and its leaders didn't change. Things went from bad to worse.
And so that brings us to the third way the prophets emphasized the covenant. They announced the consequences for breaking it, which they called the day of the Lord.
Oh yeah, the apocalypse. Visions of the end of the world.
Well, sort of. The prophets were mostly interested in how God would bring his justice on Israel's corruption and on the violent nations around them. And while explaining these local events, they often used cosmic imagery.
Cosmic imagery?
Yeah, like Jeremiah. He described the exile of the Israelites to Babylon as the undoing of creation itself. The land dissolves into chaos and disorder, no light, no animals or people. Or Isaiah described the downfall of Babylon as the disintegration of the cosmos, stars falling from the sky, the sun going dark. For the prophets, when God acts in human history to bring justice, it's a day of the Lord.
So the prophets aren't talking about the end of the world.
Well, hold on. They're doing many things at once. The cosmic imagery shows how these important events of their day fit into the bigger story of God's mission to bring down every corrupt and violent nation once and for all. The prophets cared about the present and the future, and the cosmic imagery allowed them to talk about both at the same time.
Got it. So no matter when you live, the day of the Lord's bad news if you're part of Babylon.
But it's good news if you're waiting for God's kingdom. The day of the Lord pointed to the return of the exiles to Jerusalem. And once again, the prophets use cosmic poetry to describe it. They see a new Jerusalem, like a new Garden of Eden. with all humanity living at peace with each other and with the animals. And there's a
So that's just a little bit of the imagery of the prophets and what the prophets strove to do. Prophecy does not mean telling the future. It is about the action of God in history. So prophets were not necessarily folks who had crystal balls and who would predict what will happen, more of them thinking about and talking about how God will act as history unfolds. This collection is very diverse. It was closed or canonized by the 2nd century BCE. We know that because the book of Daniel, which took place around 164 BCE, was not included in the prophets. The book of Daniel is included here in the writings, the 3rd collection of biblical literature. So we have Torah, and we have the prophets, and we have Ketuvim, the writings. And Ketuvim includes a number of books that you may have heard about before, but it includes the Psalms, many of which are read at Jewish life cycle events and also during prayer. It includes Proverbs, or words of wisdom, the story of Job. You might remember the story of Job, who's told to go to Nineveh and prophecy and talk about, that is not the book of Job, that is Jonah. But the book of Job is about a man who has everything and loses it all. And there's a whole discussion amongst his friends why that happens. Another group of books that are part of the writings are the 5 Megillot, the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Esther you might recognize from the holiday of Purim. Esther is the book that is read at Purim and tells the story of Queen Esther and King Ahasuerus. Also, the book of Ruth is a story about a woman named Ruth who is not Jewish, but marries into Judaism, and then her husband dies, and she chooses to stay with her mother-in-law rather than go back to her people. And so the book of Ruth is read on Shavuot, one of the Jewish festivals as well. So those are the books of the Bible. The writings as a collection were actually put together following the destruction of the Second Temple in around 70 CE, the Common Era, and that's when they were finally canonized. And some hold out that it was a little bit later than that, but for the most part, it was in this time period between following the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. So how do we know about these texts? Where do they come from? How do we study them and learn about them? Well, we have something called the Masoretic text. And the Tanakh is primarily written in Hebrew. Those are all 3 sections written in Hebrew. We do not have any original manuscripts. So it's not as if we have an original copy of the Tanakh. We only have copies of copies. So what we have is a study or thinking about who actually copied those texts. Who were the ones that brought them through the generations to us? Well, there were 2 groups of people that started with what they had as the original texts and copied them so that others could read them and share them and learn from them. So they were the Sophrim, who that word comes from the word book or sofer. It can also mean counters, those who count. They worked and copied the text and tried to disseminate the text approximately the 5th century BCE to the 4th century CE. So about 900 years There was this process of copying the text, writing it down, so that people could read it and learn from it. Then came the Masoretes, who are known as the preservers of tradition. Their name comes from the word Masorah, and they worked from the 4th century, round about the time that the Sofrim stopped, to the creation of the printing press. So once the printing press was created, then these Masoretes were no longer needed to copy the text from year to year in order to send it out. And the Masoretes actually added notes to the text, and they added other kinds of things that help us to read the text today. So I'm going to share with you just a couple of examples of this in looking at how the Masoretes worked with the text. So in lots of areas of the text, we find repetition of words or phrases. We call that double writing. And it's easy for the eye to see a word twice, especially in a sequence like this one that you're looking at. If you look at Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, chapter 48, verse 16, it reads, "And these shall be its dimensions, the north side 4,500 cubits, the south side," and so on. And you'll see that when the Masoretic texts and the Masoretes looked at this, there is a missing word. And the Masoretes knew it was wrong, and so they didn't add it in, but they added in kind of the vowels so that we would know how to say the word. One example. Another example is, in this case, you write only one time what should have appeared 2 times. So if you look at the text, the example is, "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. Trust in Adonai forever, for Yah Adonai is the Brak eternal." However, when we look at Isaiah, where this text comes from, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it says something like, "In peace because of you. Trust in the Lord." Trust appears 2 times in a row in the Hebrew, and the scribe only writes it once. So in this copying that took place over centuries, words are missing, words are added back in, words are left out. And so we have this situation where the Masoretes were constantly working with the text and trying to explain what it actually meant and what it actually should say. Another example. When words or phrases have similar endings, the copyist can leave something out because the eye skips it. So as they were copying, they missed a word or a phrase or an end of a word. And if you look at this text, this is from the story of Cain and Abel. And it says in the English, "And Cain spoke unto Abel his brother. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." Okay? And it says the same thing in the Hebrew. This is a direct translation. So Cain said to his brother Abel, here in Genesis 4:8, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, so in other words, the text repeats itself. If you look at the Masoretic text, it leaves out, "Let us go into the field." The 2 Hebrew words are missing because of the repetition of the field. But it makes really no sense without them. So the Masoretes actually fixed the text so that it made sense. These were some of the things that they did. Also in Hebrew, many letters look the same. Hey and chet, there's only this little piece here missing to tell the difference between these 2 letters. A final nun and the sound, a vav with a dot here that makes the sound oo, right? A nun and a gimel. Just a slight difference here on the bottom. So many times letters were confused, and especially in the copying back and forth. Many Hebrew letters can look alike. And if the copyist is a little bit sloppy, or maybe had one too many to drink that day when he started to work, he may have, put a little extra line here, turning this hey into a chet. And when the text was reviewed and read, people realized this doesn't work. This doesn't make sense. One other example. The word lo is either lamed vav or lamed aleph. They both are pronounced the same. Both of these are pronounced lo. But the first one means no or not, and the second one means to him. To him, no or not. So in the book of Psalms, Psalm 100, verse 3, we see some confusion. And it doesn't make sense unless you change the letters. And you can see right here what the Masoretes did to change it. They took the word velo and put in parentheses velo anachnu, right? And so, know ye that the Lord, he is God. It is God that hath made us, and not we ourselves. Velo and not anachnu, we ourselves. But if you look at what the Masoretes did to it, it now says, in our editions of the Bible, it is he that made us, and we are his. Velo. Hu asanu, he made us. Velo anachnu, and we are his. So just one letter being different can change the entire meaning of the text. And that's what the Masoretes were really interested in, to try to get to the true meaning of the text. So, how do we get to the most accurate text? We compare all of the ancient manuscripts we have, whether they are in Hebrew or not. So we have them in different languages. And we see on the comparison, here's Hebrew, this looks like Greek, and English. What makes sense and what doesn't make sense? What's the same and what's not the same? So we're going to talk a little bit about the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And it was done in Alexandria, Egypt, about the 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era. And Greek was the language spoken at that time. There is, it's also known, Septuagint is also known as the 70, and it included a book or set of books called the Apocrypha. These are 15 hidden books. They were written between 200 and 100 BCE. They were written in Greek, and they included, in the early Christian canon, they're included, the books of the Apocrypha are included in that canon. So here they are, and some of them are kind of interesting. So the first and second Esdras books is someone's attempt to revise the book of Ezra. So the book of Ezra was already canonized. It was closed. Nothing could be added to it. But in these two texts, we see the attempt to add material from the last two chapters of Chronicles into the and the last two chapters of the book of Nehemiah into this canon. We also see other books here. The book of Judith, written in Hebrew about 150 BC, and it was translated into Greek. The Hebrew text is lost. We don't have it. We only have the Greek text, and it's a story about a beautiful young widow named Judith. and Judith actually means Jew, so she was part of the Jewish community, and she saves her city from a military siege. None of these books were included in the Jewish scriptures, but they are part of this collection called the Apocrypha. Now, you see a section called the Additions to Esther. So what might that be about? Well, these are 6 paragraphs, long paragraphs, that are inserted into the Septuagint version of the book of Esther in several places. And they're thought to be the work of an Egyptian Jew writing about 170 BC. So it's an attempt to add in material to the story of Esther, which is already canonized. There are, as you can see, some of you may be surprised by this, but the books of the Maccabees, the first Maccabees and the second Maccabees, are actually not in the Hebrew Bible. They're not in the Tanakh. They are in this collection called the Apocrypha, and we do read them and learn from them during the holiday of Hanukkah, but they're not part of the Jewish Bible. And First and Second Maccabees, this First Maccabees was written about the year 100 BC, and BCE, and soon afterwards it was translated into Greek. And the second Maccabees was written about 161 BCE, and it tells the story of the Maccabees, the family. It tells the story of Hanukkah. So these are additional books that are not part, again, of the Jewish scriptures. So, have you heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 in the caves near Qumran. They were discovered by a young shepherd who found them in the caves, and they date from the 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE. They include part of every book of the Tanakh except one, the book of Esther. That has not been included in that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The area, by the way, consists of 11 caves with 95,000 texts or fragments of texts. So when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, we do see differences from what we have as our Bible today and what was written in those texts at that time. So we know that the biblical texts have changed over the centuries as they were copied and copied again. There are also in existence a series of targums or translations of the Bible. There is a translation of the Bible that is in Aramaic, and there are also other languages. Every book in the Bible, in the Tanakh, has a targum, has a translation, except Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel, because these books already had Aramaic sections. And the first targums were from Babylon, and later in Palestine. So the most famous of them was the Targum Onkelos, and it is a targum of the Tanakh. And you can see here I've given you an example of what the targum looks like. So this is Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim, God created, et hashamayim v'et haaretz, the heavens and the earth. That's how our Torah begins. That's the first few words in the book of Genesis. And you can see that in Aramaic, it's a little bit different sounding. Bekadmin bira Adonai yat. All right, so it already sounds different, but bekadmin means it is the same as bereshit. Bira Adonai, Yat is Et, Shemaya is Shemaim, V'Yat Ar'a is Aretz. So you can see that the language is somewhat similar, the words are somewhat similar, but we know Aramaic because whenever we say the Kaddish, we're speaking in Aramaic. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi, that is Aramaic. And you can see words like Shemaya are part of the Kaddish as well. So the one thing about the Targum Onkelos is that by translating from Hebrew to Aramaic, those who did the translating were actually commenting on the Hebrew words, because it depends on how they translate them. What Aramaic words do they use for the Hebrew words? That in and of itself is a commentary on the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so another translation is something called the Vulgate. The Vulgate was Jerome's translation of the Tanakh and the Christian scriptures into Latin. The Vulgate was commissioned by Pope Damascus in 382, 383 CE, Common Era, and they wanted to produce an authoritative Latin version. That was the whole purpose. Let's make a Latin version of the Bible. And Vulgate means common or common translation. Now, the only issue about the Vulgate is Jerome knew Greek. So he translated the Greek into Latin, right? But he learned Hebrew, Aramaic, Syriac, and Arabic to translate from as many different manuscripts as possible. So they weren't his native languages, and he learned them while he was doing the translation. So there's some question about whether he actually got it right as he translated Hebrew words into Latin as opposed to the Greek words into Latin. Now, sometimes in the Bible we find situations where there are words that we do not understand. And I've chosen this one example because it really sticks out to me as a place where that cries out for a commentary. So we have the verse, I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son. You've probably heard this before. But I was a herdsman and a gatherer of sycamore fruit. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock, and the Lord said unto me, go prophesy unto my people Israel. Now, even in the English, can anyone unmute and pick out the problem? I've highlighted it in yellow, what you want to look at, but what's the issue here? Think about how we would normally refer to someone who tends a flock. What would we call them? Well, typically, one who tends a flock, we would call a shepherd, right? But here, it's called a herdsman, right? So, what do? We look at the word boker, which is the word that's used here for herdsman. It's similar to a word used for cattle, and people often translate herdsman, but that makes no sense given the fact that it refers to the flock in the next verse. So what do we do with this? So we amend it to say noked and say shepherd. You can see the familiarity. So this bet becomes a nun. The kuf remains the same, right? And the dalet and the resh look very similar as well, correct? So what we're saying is that this probably should say ki noked anochi, not boker anochi. So sometimes there's words that are in the Bible that just don't make sense. And we try to think about how we can change them. So how do we get to the text we have today? How do we get to the text that we have, that we look at when we're in synagogue or when we're studying? So we look at some important things to consider when we look at these texts. The process of canonization took over 600 years. Over 600 years. The texts themselves were written and edited over more than 1,000 years. So just think about that for a moment, that period of time when we have these texts passed down from, one generation to the next, copied, written by hand, and then passed down. The stories that are in these texts cover a period of more than 2,000 years. It was mostly written in Hebrew, some in Aramaic. So to get the most original form of the text, you also have to understand Greek, Syriac, Latin, and probably a few other languages. And we have to keep in mind all the time that translation is always interpretation. Anytime a text is translated from one language to another, there is interpretation going on. As we, the funny thing is that we say, we use a Yiddish word, and then we ask, well, what does that mean in English? And someone will say to you, well, you can't translate that into English. It doesn't translate well. And so that's the same thing that we face when we look at biblical texts as well. So the first English translation that we have on record was done by John Wycliffe in the 14th century. And the first English translation from Hebrew was done by William Tyndale in 1526. So it was those two times when we had the first English Bible, and both after the invention of the printing press. So what we have as well is the King James Version, which many of you probably have heard about. In 1604, King James I of England decided to commission an authorized version of the Scripture for the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So he wanted an English version, and so 54 scholars were divided into 6 panels, and 2 groups met at Oxford, 2 at Cambridge, and 2 at Westminster. And they all worked on translating the Bible. And the king ran out of money for the project, as happens, and needed help from the church. So the church helped him with finances, and it was finally published in 1611, the King James Version. And that's the version that many use to today. But again, it was 1611. The Revised Standard Version, which came out in 1952, was designed to update and revise the King James Version. So there were changes made in the King James Version in things that were not correct. It uses formal correspondence and translates from the Hebrew and Greek for a modern English reader. So they use different sources to do the translation. And again, in 1978, there was a new international version, was done by Protestant evangelicals, and it also used formal correspondence. They wrote back and forth to each other, and that's where it goes. So that's just a bit about thinking about the Bible and how we look at it being passed down from generation to generation. Before there was a printing press, before at the time when people actually wrote it by hand. And we see in the Bible a number of places where there are mistakes, where there are words that we don't understand. And it's important to continue this study because even as we continue the study and we look at these different changes that took place, we tend to find out more about our Jewish tradition and our Jewish past by looking at these different parts of our tradition. So, thank you very much for being with us tonight, and we are going to stop the share, and everyone can return to the main room, I believe, for the closing portion.